I'm Dr. Sunita Iyer. Our next topic is going to be adverse childhood events, or ACEs. So let's start off with something to consider before we get into it. You have a student in your classroom who's fidgeting in their chair and already has a plan for preferential seating and breaks. So start to visualize this little person in your classroom and start to think about how you would respond and potentially how some of what we've discussed thus far in terms of theories of development, models of thinking, and our neurobiology influences the way that you might actually think about the student now. So let's talk a little bit about ACEs. What are they? Adverse childhood events are something that has been well studied for several decades now, and most of what's been studied has looked at adult populations, specifically looking at what are the events that have occurred in the childhood of people who are now adults, and how do those adverse childhood events or those stressors actually impact the adult's ongoing health and longevity. And what we've seen in the research and the studies is that when people who are now adults have experienced adverse childhood events, there are very distinct correlations with the health of those adults, meaning that what we see is adults experience more cardiovascular disease, more high blood pressure, so heart disease and stroke, and other chronic health issues as a result of their adverse childhood events. So what are the adverse childhood events that adults are experiencing that contribute to those health outcomes? There are different types of abuse that people can experience: physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, both physical and emotional neglect, and different types of household dysfunction. So whether they were raised or parented by people who were experiencing mental illness, whether there were people in the household who were incarcerated, whether they were experiencing substance use and abuse, domestic violence, divorce. So there are any number of childhood events that can actually influence whether or not adults experience chronic healthcare outcomes that might not necessarily be related to their diet or whether they exercised or whether they slept well, but very specifically to these events that they experienced in their childhood. And what we're starting to realize about our adult population, and now starting to realize about our school-based population, is that when people have one or more ACE, they have a certain amount of chronic health correlations with that. When people experience 3 or 4 of these adverse childhood events, they actually have a very, very high risk of chronic health care concerns as they get into adulthood. And it's actually a lot more prevalent than we think. So when we are thinking about our students who are the children potentially experiencing these adverse childhood events, we have to think about the fact that these are things that are influencing them now and are affecting their behavior now and are actually contributing to the way that their brain is starting to dump chemicals into their body right now and the behaviors that we're seeing right now in our classrooms. So we're less concerned about their chronic health concerns later, but also how we could be contributing to that in our particular environment. So we'll get a little bit more into that in terms of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed education. But the key for us to understand about kiddos in our settings is that these ACEs are much more prevalent than we used to think. And that what's true is that our students are about 30 to 40% of the time experiencing one or more of these ACEs, which means that a lot of our students in our classrooms are showing or demonstrating signs of those ACEs, and that these behaviors we might actually be seeing and trying to manage might not necessarily be a result of a child's inability to make a choice about behavior, but specifically related to the stressors that they're experiencing in their home life or otherwise, or at school. And that these stressors are also shifting their neurobiology and making it so that it's difficult for them to engage in behaviors that we think of as more desirable, or to be in compliance, or to negotiate their behavior such that we can come up with a management plan. So think here about how the inequity that kiddos experience socially, culturally, within school settings themselves and potentially in their home-based settings could be correlated with 4 or more of these ACEs. So think about our kiddos who experience socioeconomic disparities, racial disparities, and other inequities in their world, and how that in and of itself actually contributes to the amount of ACEs that a kiddo is experiencing, and how that could heighten their stress response, their normal neurobiologic stress response, and then how we might see that correlate to behaviors in the classroom. And think about as well who our students are that are most commonly disciplined in our classrooms and in our schools. Think about who the students are that teachers, administrators have come to associate with, say, poorer behaviors or poorer choices around desirable behaviors in the classroom. And how much of that might actually be rooted in the racism, classism, and inequities and disparities that these kiddos are experiencing, the level of stress that that creates in their own lives, and the level of normal neurobiologic response that these kiddos are having to these experiences that they are not in control of. And therefore, how we're responding to all of those stressors in their lives as behavior problems, when truly what's happening is that they are having stressors that they are not in control of and behavioral neurobiologic responses to that they are not in control of. And we are asking them to be in control of their behavior. Consider how even being an investigator, a detective in that situation to understand what could be underlying a kid's behavior, simply from an adverse childhood events perspective, could radically shift the way that we respond to that kiddo and we respond to their behavior in a classroom and then decide to apply discipline. And then think about future prospects of how that could influence that kiddo's trajectory, not just in elementary school, but moving into middle school and into high school, and then beyond that into higher education. And how those ACEs, disparities, stressors, normal neurologic responses to that, and our responses to their behaviors can actually change the way that they are perceived all throughout their school education. So take a moment to consider this student here. You have a student in your classroom who gets frustrated, gives up really easily. This kiddo shuts down when something seems hard, he isn't called on soon enough, and then at some point there are some outbursts. That includes knocking over chairs, kicking, throwing markers. Transitions have always been difficult and can be difficult if this kiddo is already escalated. You've also noticed that this person has a pretty low energy level and often needs a lot of snacks and attention to keep him going. This is an elementary age kid. So let's head back to our models of thinking. If we are simply thinking compliance model, undesirable behaviors, let's get to desirable behaviors, how might we respond? If we are thinking management model, undesirable behaviors, we want them to get to desirable behaviors, but we're going to try to make a plan. But this kiddo might not necessarily be in a place where they can make a plan. They may be flooded already, meaning that their normal neurobiological response has already flooded the front part of their brain and made it difficult to actually come up with a management plan. So if we're going to be an investigator or detective here, what might we think about? So we're going to think about what we now understand about theories of development and our understanding of normal. We're going to think about the inequitable and racist and classist underpinnings of those theories of development. We're going to think about ACEs now, and we're going to think about what stressors could this kiddo actually be experiencing right now, because we know from all of the studies on ACEs that a huge portion of our population is experiencing them. So we know that it's very likely this kiddo is experiencing some. We could start to investigate what those could be. And then we can start to understand how those stressors, coupled with our models of thinking, could actually be contributing to a normal biologic stress response that is flooding this kiddo's brain and making it difficult for them to get to the place where we can have a more harmonious classroom and this person can be a participant in that. So from here, we'll move move into a discussion on trauma-informed care and trauma-informed teaching, so we can start to apply our understanding of ACEs and stressors to a more compassionate way of thinking about the behaviors we see in the classroom and thinking about strategies to address these behaviors and our own well-being in those situations.